Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Cade. I'm joined by my friend Andrew, and this is our review for Quantum of Solace from 2008. So, Andrew, when it comes to Quantum of Solace, I gotta be honest with you, of all five movies in the Daniel Craig era, I think this is probably my least favorite. I don't know, where does it sit with you?
It's definitely bottom two with me. I didn't hate this movie. To me, this is kind of just a middle of the road movie. I actually think Spectre is worse than this because Spectre I was more excited for and thus more disappointed when it came out. This kind of just came and went without really leaving that much of an impression to me, weirdly enough.
Yeah, I know that it's not a Bond movie that gets talked about enough, but I just want to make it clear it might be my least favorite in the Craig era, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad movie by any means.
No, again, it's not bad. It's just again, it's very middle of the road. It kind of just shows up and leaves and doesn't really leave that much of an impact on you.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we go over our pros and cons of this movie? First off, one thing that I have to say is definitely a pro, and it's a pro with all five of these movies, would definitely have to be Daniel Craig as James Bond. Daniel Craig is probably my favorite James Bond of all time, right next to Sean Connery. He always gives a powerful performance as Bond throughout the entirety of his franchise. He's able to always capture, I think, Bond's trauma from the events of the first film, especially, everything that he went through with Vesper and everything else. You can really see the trauma that's built inside him throughout this movie. And I always think that he does such a great job humanizing Bond in all his movies.
Yeah, and that's something I always enjoy about the Bond or the Daniel Craig era James Bond movies is that there is very much kind of a consistent chord throughout all of them regarding his character, the character development of James Bond and how he is affected by the events of previous films. And that definitely is in this one. You can definitely tell he's kind of still recovering from everything that happened in Casino Royale. And again, Daniel Craig does a great job playing him. He's a lot more of a human James Bond as opposed to, say, the Pierce Brosnan era or the Roger Moore era, which was a little bit more and put a little bit more emphasis on the suave ladies man esque of James Bond as opposed to the actual like more human character. And that's something I've always liked about the Craig Bonds.
Yo, yeah, agreed. Daniel Craig is definitely best standout in this movie, especially. And another thing that I do want to point out is, and I know that this isn't really regarded as strong as Casino Royale, but I think the action in this movie is decent. I think back to like the opening chase scene where Bond is battling that double agent who was posing as M's bodyguard, and they have that little chase sequence. I also look back at, the knife fight between Bond and Edmund Slate. That knife fight, I think, I mean, it's not long, but I think it's definitely a standout in terms of fight sequence or action sequence. I also think the final battle, yeah, at the end of this film, while it's not exactly as thrilling or memorable as the one in Casino Royale, I think it's a decent battle. Again, it's not nothing incredible in my opinion, but it's still decent and it's not really a letdown in any way.
Yeah, all the Craig Bonds have good action sequences. I believe they're all done by the same stunt coordinator, if I'm not mistaken. And while this one doesn't have as iconic of action scenes as say the bike chase scene in what was that Casino Royale or
Skyfall,
Skyfall?
Skyfall.
Skyfall, and then the train chase sequence in Casino Royale, which is not just an awesome action sequence, in my opinion, it's one of the best opening action sequences in film history. Again, it does still feel very punchy. It's very well choreographed. Again, though, this is just such a middle of the road movie for me. Weirdly enough, like it's not the most memorable Bond, but it's by no means the worst. And I know we'll get into the cons in a minute, but again, it really does just sort of it shows up to the party and it leaves, and you never know it was there.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from with that. But aside from Daniel Craig and all the action that we see in this movie, one thing that I do want to point out, and I don't think this really gets talked about enough, and I know people probably have different opinions on it, but I actually kind of liked the character of Camille in this movie. And here's why. So I like how, she is a Bond girl in this movie, but I like how she's not just there to help Bond out on the mission. I think that you can tell throughout the movie she has her own goals. She wants to hunt down General Madrano because of what he did to her family. And she does accomplish that. And it's not just she falls into, Bond's mission and ends up helping him out. She had her own goals that had her end up in the story. And so I did like seeing that, having a Bond girl that actually has her own motives that she actually accomplishes. So I think that what's also nice is, despite her and Bond sharing that brief romantic moment at the end of the film, I think that the movie presents them more as allies rather than love interests, which I think was kind of nice.
Yeah, and that is a nice change of pace. And honestly, that's something all the Craig Bonds do quite well is that they're not just Bond girls for the sake of being Bond girls. They've got something else motivating them. Vesper's another one who is kind of starts off as more of an ally, but eventually does end up as more of a romantic interest. And then obviously probably the best one is Madeline from Spectre and then No Time to Die, because obviously she has a very profound impact on James Bond, but she's also got her own outside motivations as well.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, that's definitely another highlight, just the character of Camille. But why don't we get into our cons with this movie now? So for me personally, I think my biggest con is probably just the overall story of the film. Now, I don't think the story is necessarily, I'm not saying it's a stinker or anything. It's just compared to Casino Royale and what the plot was of that movie, it is kind of underwhelming, in my opinion.
Yeah, because Casino Royale's plot was in Skyfall, Spectre, and No Time to Die. Those were all plots that actually seemed evil.
Yeah.
I mean, they made some of them were about, killing lots of people. Some of them were about appeasing some very angry, very powerful people. Dominic Green's plot is basically just capitalism. We're going to steal something from a group of people and then sell it back to them at a marked up rate. That's not evil. That's just American capitalism.
Well, and that's another thing. So, and we'll get back to Green in a minute, but I think that one of the issues I have with the plot of this movie is I think that it's just kind of all over the place from beginning to end. From beginning, it seems like it's going to be one thing, but then it turns into something else, and it just kind of gets really jumbled throughout the whole movie. And one other thing, like one other issue I have, is that I think this movie relies a little too heavily on Casino Royale to exist.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. And I mean, yeah, all the Craig bonds are connected. This one feels really, really like a sequel to just Casino Royale, and kind of needs that movie to exist for this one to exist. And most of the time, that's not a bad thing, but it just feels like this movie. You need the required reading of Casino Royale to understand the plot of this movie.
Yeah, and I think another big criticism that a lot of people had, and I can kind of see where they're coming from, was that they said the movie felt more like an action thriller than a Bond movie.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, definitely. And it just feels less polished than Casino Royale. Casino Royale felt like a very well made, very, very slick, modern interpretation of James Bond. This one, it feels like, heck, it could have used like maybe one more script do over and maybe some different direction or some different production input. But I know there's a very good reason for that. And I believe you are looking forward to talking about that.
Yeah, before we get into that, why don't we just talk about Dominic Green one last time? So, yeah, Dominic Green as a villain, he just wasn't really all that interesting or compelling of a character, especially compared to Lashif from the first movie. And even Mr. White, I think. I think Mr. White actually should have been the villain of this movie. I think that would have been interesting.
Yeah, I think that Mr. White would have been a better choice for the villain because, again, Dominic Green kind of just, he doesn't leave that much of an impression. Like, and I'm not super familiar with the actor who plays him, but he's not as memorable or as intimidating as Lashif or Silver from Skyfall, or even what's the character's name from No Time to Die that Rami Malek plays? The really hard to pronounce name.
Lucifer Safin.
Bless you. Again, he's just not really that memorable. And I think the plot that he has, the fact that it's not, again, the fact that it is basically just a capitalist scheme doesn't, or really does hurt him as a character, weirdly enough.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from with that. But regarding that, and also just how the plot of this movie turned out, like you had mentioned, not too long ago, there is a reason for why it turned out that way. And that has to do with the 2007 to 2008 writer's strike that happened. So, yeah, they were in the middle of developing this movie during that strike. And because of that, when the strike happened, they couldn't employ a writer to create a final version of the film, a final draft. So, yeah, I think because of that, the movie couldn't have been the, I guess, better version of what it was. So, Yeah, I think that's probably. I think if the writer strike hadn't happened and they had actually gotten, if they could have actually produced a final version that they were fully satisfied with, I think we could have gotten a better movie.
Yeah, like I said, it feels like this needed like one more script do over, and the fact that they were on strike, I'm sure had kind of prevented that from happening. But I mean, it's not the worst James Bond movie. I'd still say that would be something like Moonraker, but that's not one of my favorites. It's definitely lower tier, but it's definitely not the worst. Like I said, it shows up to the party and then leaves, and you never know it was there.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but yeah, on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you give it?
Uh, I'll give it a 6. Again, it's not the worst James Bond, but it's by no means the best. And something I noticed weird about the Daniel Craig era James Bonds was we had good movie, bad movie, good movie, bad movie, good movie, because we had Casino Royale, which was great, this, which was mediocre, Skyfall, which was great, Spectre, which was boring as hell, and then No Time to Die, which was pretty good.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to give it a 6.5. It's not one of the best Bond movies, but I think it still has its moments, and there were areas where it could have been improved. But yeah, I think I'll give it a 6.5. That seems like a good rating for it. All right, guys, I think that that's the end of this review. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you later. Thanks. Bye.